And today I am going to talk about Black History Month and the history of Black history. And so let me start out by saying that 2026 is the 250th year anniversary of the founding of the United States of America. But 2026 is also the 100th anniversary of the founding of the celebration of Black history. Black history began to be celebrated in 2026 when, in 1926 when Carter G. Woodson established Negro History Week. And let me tell you a little bit about the beginnings of this process. Actually, it all started with a Black woman by the name of Mary Church Terrell. And Mary Church Terrell, her parents were enslaved. She was born in 1863, and right at the time of the Emancipation Proclamation. And her parents actually became successful in business after slavery, and they were able to provide her with a high quality education. So she graduated from Oberlin College in Ohio in, I think, around 1884. And then she obtained a master's degree a couple of years later. So she was a very educated Black woman at that time, which was rare for Black women to have access to that quality of education. But Mary Church Terrell, not only was she very conscious in terms of having a formal education, but she was politically active in her entire life. So she struggled to work for voting rights. She also worked for women's suffrage to get the right to vote for women, and Black women in particular. And it's very interesting to look at her background, but she became a school board member in Washington, D.C. And when she became a school board member in the late 1890s, as a school board member, she started actually in 1897. She started a program of celebration of Frederick Douglass. And so Frederick Douglass Day, they established February 14th as Frederick Douglass Day. Now, Frederick Douglass didn't know his actual birth date. He just speculated he was born in February. So they picked February 14th, which was so-called Valentine's Day, and they celebrated that as a day to celebrate Frederick Douglass. And so this Frederick Douglass Day was actually passed by the Washington, D.C. School Board, and it became part of a tradition. And what happened is this began to spread and pass around the country into segregated Black schools. So segregated Black schools started dedicating a day to Frederick Douglass and recognizing the work that Frederick Douglass did, his statesmanship, his history, and also the book about his life, his autobiography. And so this became very foundational to the beginning of a Black history movement in the United States. And in 1915, Dr. Carter G. Woodson established an organization called the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History. And the following year, in 1916, he began to publish, and that was the organization, the Association for the Life, for the Study of Negro life and history was actually founded in 1915. And then a year later, in 1916, Carter G. Woodson began publishing on a regular basis the Journal of Negro History. And this was continually published, and then, of course, it transformed its name to the Journal of African American History, etc. But we can go back and see those early copies of those journals. A lot of libraries, especially older libraries or university libraries, you might be able to find the whole collection of journals of Negro history, and then their subsequent after their name change. But this began to become a way to document Black history. So you have various different professors and scholars could write, and they would write and get published in this Journal of Negro History. And so scholarly articles by Black scholars, people that were studying at the college and university level, and they were researching Black history and documenting it. And it would get documented in this journal, the Journal of Negro History. And this became very important because not only was just raw history being documented, but sociological studies, other information regarding what was going on in the Black community, investigations and analysis of like lynchings and all kinds of events were being documented by Black people in this this Journal of Negro History. And so in 2026, like 10 years later, after collecting all of this information for about 10 years, Carter G. Woodson made a next step, and that is to establish Negro History Week, so that people could talk about this stuff, this data, this information that had been collected, this accumulation of knowledge of Black history. And what they did was they started this program of Negro History Week. And of course, with it, they had a curriculum. They had an educational program where they would use this information they've collected over a period of time and begin to share Black history and to talk about Black history. And so Black History Week became a celebration that primarily was something that was just done internally in the Black community. Black churches did it, Black community organizations did it, and Black families did it, until eventually it became something that was brought into segregated schools. And what happened is in Black schools, they would celebrate this Negro History Week. And it also began to become part of the curriculums all year long. And so this process, if we look at this process as it's taking place, all during this time, not only now are we having people talking about Black history in schools, not only are we having people talking about Black history in communities, but we have curriculum that's being developed, that's put out there by Carter G. Woodson. And in addition to that, it's now being formally adopted in some schools, and particularly Black schools. And so you have more and more information that's going out, but at the same time, you have Black scholars now who are writing, who are publishing, and they're continuing to develop this body of knowledge in the Journal of Negro History. And so in terms of looking at and understanding this process, that this process continues to go on until in the 1940s. In the 1940s, and actually let me mention 33 first. In 1933, Carter G. Woodson published a book entitled The Miseducation of the Negro. And this book became a very popular book in the Black community, and particularly amongst Black intellectuals. And so it began to take a look at and examine what was happening. And this book was probably a response to some of the earlier documents that were being put out there by Arnold Toynbee, because Arnold Toynbee was considered a British scholar, and he was actually on the cover of Time magazine in about 1947. And Arnold Toynbee did this 12-volume of set called A Study of History. And in it, he says that the, quote, Negro, first he says he studied 21 civilizations around the world. And the, quote, Negro has made no creative contribution to any of the 21 civilizations that he studied around the world. And of course, this wasn't true. It was just a piece of propaganda. It was just an outright bold-faced racist lie. And so this became a way to be able to document and to refute some of the stuff in the Journal of Negro History. But the Arnold Toynbee documents, the study of history, it actually became part of the education system in Europe and America, and became part of the history and social studies. And they used the materials from Arnold Toynbee to mold and shape the curriculums in the United States. And it was an anti-black, just simply racist curriculum. And so in terms of looking at this and understanding this history, it becomes very, very significant to look at and really genuinely see how things are unfolding in terms of Black history. So during this period of time, you have a number of scholars come forward, Black scholars. You're having more and more Black scholars come on the scene because Black people are gaining more and more access to education. You have historically Black colleges now that you have programs that are focusing on documenting Black history, and people are collecting records and documents, and they're compiling them, they're publishing books, and they're establishing collections. You have a number of Black people that are establishing collections, and they're getting books and artifacts, and they're getting all kinds of information and establishing collections. And these collections are now being housed in historically Black colleges and universities. They're being housed in certain kinds of libraries all around the country. And so like the Bloxham collection, for example, at Temple University, this 500,000 piece collection of books and articles and artifacts that is a Black history collection created by Charles Bloxham, and it became housed at Temple University. There was the Pauline A. Young collection at the University of Delaware, and Pauline Young was a librarian, and she collected Black history information her entire life, and she passed on at about 104 years old. But she collected all of this information, and she actually donated this information to me in an organization that I was operating at the time, and we did not have the resources to maintain such a library at the time. So we worked with the African American Cultural Historical Society in Delaware so that they could take possession of this collection, and then they ultimately made an arrangement for it to be housed and maintained at the University of Delaware, where it is today. So you could go there and you have a vast collection of Black history documents and research that she collected over her lifetime, where what she did was literally every room in her house, in her home, was covered in books and materials and artifacts that she collected during her entire lifetime. So she dedicated her entire life to collecting Black history information so that she could pass it down to the next generation. And she was a unique individual. She was also an activist, had been involved in a lot of community stuff, and brilliant mind, very educated about Black history, but she established this vast collection that she could pass on. And there were actually multiple collections all around the country of Black people that did this. So you have these Black history collections all over the country, and they're very important collections because they document Black history, and very often with original documents that they have maintained this information so that Black history, and I always call it our sacred Black history, because of what people went through to maintain these documents. And very often they went through a lot of trials and tribulations to maintain these documents and to keep them from being taken away or destroyed, or efforts to try to block them from becoming something that was available to the public, and particularly black people. And so there was all these efforts always to stop black people from being able to access this information. But there were black people who were dedicated to collecting this information. And there were also black people who were dedicated to studying this information and publishing on it. And the Journal of Negro History became one of those major publications early on where black people began to actually publish this stuff. Also, you can go back and there was journals that actually took place before the Civil War, like Freedom Journal. There was about 40 black newspapers or journals before the Civil War that where black people actually documented and recorded black history and talked about contemporary issues that were going on that document the history of what happened during slavery. And most of what we know today comes from those sources. And it's a myth that, that this is some YT history, YT people told us this history. That's not true at all. This history was collected by black people. This history was written by black people. It was journaled, it was documented, and was established by black people. And many of these documents have been passed down generation after generation and still exist. You have many that are actually in the Library of Congress. You have them in various private collections. Many of these documents actually made their way into the hands of individuals who collected this information, and then they made sure that it got preserved in a collection. So it's a very interesting thing. In addition to that, you can also see that anywhere you go in the world today, whether it's in the United States or throughout Europe, Asia, you will see that most museums are going to have, especially any significant museum systems, they're going to have some kind of collection on ancient Egypt and some kind of collection on Africa. And if you look at around the world, people would say, oh, well, Africa didn't have any history. They never did anything. But you can see the collection of artifacts that were taken from Africa in the looting and plunder of Africa. They harvested artifacts, they harvested documents, and these are in collections all over the globe. Statues, monuments, papyrus, documents, artwork, all types of things are in these collections all around the world. And one of the challenges that Professor Cheikh Anta Diop used to give out, and Professor Cheikh Anta Diop was a physicist, a mathematician, he was a polymath, he was a genius. And he was the one who developed the Institute of Fundamental Afrikaners, which is the Institute of Fundamental Black Africa at the University of Dakar in Senegal. And of course, now the university is named in his honor, the University Cheikh Anta Diop. But he wrote the book entitled African Origin of Civilization, as well as multiple other books. But one of the things that Professor Diop promoted was the ideal that we have to rescue and reconstruct black history. And basically what he was telling us was, look, if you want to really know black history, go investigate the collection of black artifacts taken from Africa that are scattered all around the world, because they tell us a story about Africa. They tell us a story about our history. So we have a robust history. And Marcus Garvey once said that we have a glorious history, and we shall create another in the future that will astonish the world. And Garvey had the opportunity to travel in Europe and see some of the artifacts that were collected in some of these museums, like in the British Museum and other places, that actually stole the history of black people and have maintained it, in various different libraries. And so in terms of looking at and understanding the unfolding of this and the history of black history, it becomes very critical to recognize and I think to understand that as this process unfolded, by 1976, during the bicentennial year, the 200-year celebration of the United States of America, President Gerald Ford officially recognized Black History Month. But it's important to recognize the situation because if you go back just a few years before, there had been a bunch of controversy surrounding Black History Month. And of course, you had YT segregationists and racists. They didn't want to celebrate Black History Month. They didn't want their children to learn anything about Black history. And, and it's a familiar pattern repeating. They didn't want to know anything about Black history. And they didn't want this taught to the children. And they especially didn't want their children to know what their ancestors did to Black people. But in 1969, there was a group of Black students, the Black United Students. It was a Black student union organized at Kent State University. And this is the university where you hear the song "For Dead in Ohio," where they unalive 4 students at Kent State University, and you hear a bunch of stuff about that. But if you look at the situation that was developing in terms of the protest and all that, it wasn't just about protest in Vietnam. This was a group that now had adopted Black History Month, and who in 1969 they established Black History Month, and they changed the name to Black History Month from Negro History Month. So in the 1940s, it became known as Negro History Month, but in 1969, they changed it to Black History Month. And because of their activism and protests, this spread on college campuses all over the country. And as a consequence of this celebration of Black History Month and Black people embracing this concept, it gained so much momentum that eventually in 1976, President Gerald Ford acknowledged Black History Month for the very first time, and it was officially recognized by the government. And this was very significant during this period of time because this was at the height of the desegregation controversies that were going on all around the country, because there was unrest all over the country regarding school desegregation. And so it's interesting to look at this history and how this history unfolded. But there's also something else I want to point out. I want to point out that there's a story. It's called Sleepers in the Cave. And it actually appears in the writings of Plato in book number 7 of Plato's Republic. It also is a story that existed a little earlier than Plato, this was about 520 BC. And there was a story of Heraclitus that was this story, the Sleepers of the Cave story by Heraclitus. It was a similar story, but it was an adaptation. All of these stories actually came from a much earlier ancient Egyptian writing that was established by Black people from Nubia. But it got passed down and became something that was Heraclitus adopted, and then Plato adopted it, and then later a version of it appears in Ephesus, in the so-called Middle East region, Asia Minor. In Ephesus, this appears, this story of the sleepers in the cave, and then ultimately it appears in the Quran, in the Islamic religion. And it's about these sleepers, in the cave. Now, there are variations on the story, and there are various twists on the story. But the story essentially is about some people who go into this cave, and it's variations on the reason that they go and why they go, and also how long they stay. But in general, they go, and they're in there about 300 years. But the point that I want to illustrate to compare to now in our understanding of Black history is that just think of a group of people who, let's say they're living in a world, and the world is moving on, and people are progressing, and humanity is doing what it's doing and all of that. and you have a group of people, you take them out of the society, and then you put them in a cave and isolate them. And then just imagine they could live for 300 years, and then you bring them out of the cave and put them back into society. In reality, 300 years has passed. 300 years of progress has passed. Just think of if someone were to have taken you and put you in a cave in 1900, in 1890, and then brought you here today, and now people have cell phones, there's televisions, there's automobiles, there's, airplanes flying, there's all kinds of technology that exists now that didn't quite exist back then. There's a whole different lifestyle. There's a whole different level of knowledge. There's a whole different set of circumstances. And so, even though there are variations on this story, the point of the matter is that if you look at it and look at what happened to black people were taken from the African continent. They were placed into slavery. They were denied an opportunity for education. They were cut off from the knowledge of their own history. They were cut off from the knowledge of the past. They were cut off from even the knowledge of current developments, with the exception of those things they needed to be diluted to keep them into slavery. And so in terms of looking at and understanding where black people then fit in how this story illustrates some of the conditions that black people experienced, imagine black people now in a circumstance where we are now entering back into human society. We now have an opportunity to do things because now we're now citizens. Before we were chattel. So in 1868 we became citizens, and we were no longer just chattel. We became Americans at that point because we were naturalized and adopted as American citizens. Prior to that, they said that we aren't citizens and we have no rights, which white people are bound to respect. But in 1868, that changed. And even though it changed, we were still subjected to all kinds of atrocities because there were people that opposed this. And if you look at all of this history and how this history is unfolded, and if you genuinely look at to try to understand the struggle that black people went through just to learn, just to gain knowledge, just to understand what happened in the past. And you look at the struggles that people went through to preserve the knowledge. It's just like you hear about the Dead Sea Scrolls in the Qumran caves, that this group of people, because they were under attack and the Romans were coming and the Romans were destroying their culture, their community, they were unaliving their people. And what happened is a small group of people got together and they took the sacred literature of their time, the sacred writings, and they went up and they hid them in the Qumran caves. So they were hidden away so that nobody could find them to destroy them. And it was a way to preserve their history, to preserve their culture, to preserve the knowledge of their people. And so I want you to really think about that, because that's what actually happened with black people. There were black people, while black people were being plundered, while we were being looted, while we were under attack, there were black people that had the insight to gather our history, to gather our artifacts, to gather our writings, to gather our information, and to take it and secure it so that future generations could know. And so when we talk about Black History Month is just sort of the tip of the iceberg. It's a culmination of events that have been taking place for centuries. So in terms of looking at this and trying to put it in context, I think it's very critical for us to be able to get that and realize that No, our history is not some narrative that YT people gave us, and that is somebody who has been told something in ignorance, and they accept it, and they're just regurgitating ignorance, and it's propaganda that's targeted at black people so that we won't trust our history, so that we won't accept our history, and that they can give us a false narrative that misleads us and misguides us. And so when we began to look at this process that took place, and we see the work that Carter G. Woodson did with the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History that he founded in 1915, and then eventually over a period of time they changed it to the name to the Association for the Study of Afro-American Life and History, and then ultimately to the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. And it's a journal all the time that's been continually published since 1916 that codifies and documents our history, where some of our finest minds have documented what went on and have published this information in essence, a peer-reviewed journal. And so, and there are other black journals. There was Carter G. Woodson in 1921 established something called the Associated Publishers. And what they did was they started this project so that black people could get their books published, so that black people could tell the story of black people. You look at the Harlem Renaissance, and you look at the number of writers that came out of the Harlem Renaissance. It was a collective of black people working together to publish this information. So you had, authors like Richard Wright, and you had many black scholars, Langston Hughes and Thornhill Hurston, and you had a host of black writers who wrote about black history, who wrote about the black experience, and created this Harlem Renaissance body of literature. And then, of course, you had the Schomburg collection that was a collection of black history during this time. And this was at a time when black people were united, whether they were from the Caribbean or whether they were from the United States or other parts of the world. This is when black people were conscious of who they are and how they are connected to each other. They also were connected to the Pan-African Conference and the Pan-African Congresses, and they were connected in a global effort to get a universal declaration of human rights. And so it's a body of literature that developed, and a very important piece is this Miseducation of the Negro that was published in 1933. But there are also many people are not aware that if we look at Carter G. Woodson, in 1922, Carter G. Woodson published a book entitled The Negro in Our History. It was one of the first history books that talked about black history. And he published this in 1922. And of course, there had been black history publications before with W.E.B. Du Bois and J.A. Rogers and Martin Delany. And so there's a bunch of black people publishing. But what Carter G. Woodson is doing is he is actually collecting this information and tailoring it toward a school-age population. Most of the other stuff is directed to people that are college level, that are grown. But he's now developing stuff that's directed that can be taught in school systems, that can be taught in the segregated black schools, that can be talked about in the family setting, that where black people, this information can permeate the entire black community. He also wrote a book in 1928 that was entitled African Myths Together with Proverbs, so that he was talking about a moral education. He was talking about wisdom and knowledge. And Carter G. Woodson was promoting these ideals and these thoughts for black people, to organize black people. And he was doing this even before he published the famous book, The Miseducation of the Negro. And in addition to that, with the founding of Negro History Week, Carter G. Woodson had a curriculum that he promoted about black history, so that black people had a systematic course of study to learn about black history and to be able, to to follow a course of study that could be not only doing Black History Week during that time or Negro History Week, but that could be used throughout a curriculum throughout the course of the year. And so this ideal about promoting Black history became very, very significant. And so, when we go through and we look at some of this stuff that was going on, I want to mention something I think is very significant also. It wasn't until 1968 that at the San Francisco State University, there was a Black student union, and they led a 5-month strike. In other words, they said is, look, we protest, we're not going to class, we're not doing anything until you bring a Black history program into our school. We want to learn about Black history and Black studies, and it needs to be a part of our curriculum. We pay tuition, but you don't talk anything about us, you don't have any history about us. And they led this strike in 1968. Think of 1968. That's not long ago. 5-month strike. And what happened is it resulted in the very first Black Studies department being developed at a college or university in the United States. And so this was the very first time a college or university in the United States actually dedicated a whole department to the study of Black history and Black studies. And this happened in 1968, not very long ago. And so when you look at some of the history and you understand the Civil Rights Movement, and you get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, and you see the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and then you see Jesse Jackson come along, and he's doing a campaign for fairness and equity and reciprocity for Black people to gain access to businesses and to desegregate the corporate boardrooms and give Black people an opportunity to participate as owners in major corporations and businesses. And you see Black franchises develop. You see Black advertisers prosper. Black newspapers get advertisement from major companies. You see Wall Street begin to make financial deposits into Black-owned banks, and you see that kind of work, all those things that are going on. At the same time, here in 1968, a group of Black students now have pressured and forced a university to have a Black studies program, a Black history program that is at the department level. Now, there were other schools that had maybe one person or they had an office or something like that. But this was the first time where there was an entire department dedicated to this topic in the systematic study and collection of information. And so this was a very significant breakthrough. And that project was actually led by Dr. Nathan Hare. And of course, many of you may have heard of Dr. Nathan and Dr. Julia Hare. And they were very significant individuals within Black history and in the scholarly community. And so this was led by Dr. Nathan Hare, and the program began to develop in the early 1970s. And from there, you saw programs begin to develop all across the country. And then ultimately in the 1980s, Dr. Molefi Asante established the very first PhD level African American Studies program in the world at Temple University. And this became a very significant breakthrough for Black people because this is the very first time there is a PhD level program offered in African American Studies so that Black people can study this and actually obtain a PhD in African American Studies. And they began to produce significant scholars to begin to bring and collect this information and do the research and bring the information and write and publish. And it brought together scholars like Professor Cheikh Anta Diop. It brought Theophilo Bengo. It brought John Henry Clark. It brought Leonard Jeffries and Ivan Van Sertima. And it brought a host of black scholars from all around the world together to begin to share this information and share their writings and share their information and present this information and build a group of black people who were well educated and knowledgeable about black history. Prior to that, you didn't have a lot of folks of black people that knew about their history. A lot of black people knew some superficial things. They knew a few things. They heard about Harriet Tubman. They heard about, Booker T. Washington. They maybe knew a little bit about, Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman. But for the most part, there was not a lot of information that was available. Black people didn't have access but to a limited amount of information. And even some of the most critical books that were out there, whether it's J.A. Rogers' Africa's Gifts to America, or whether it was Superman to Man, or whether it was Martin Delaney's his book about the origin of races and colors, and all. When you began to go and look at the literature that's out there, there weren't a lot of black bookstores until the late 60s and 70s and 80s. So black people didn't have access to a lot of this material. A lot of this material was rare. You could rarely find it. And a lot of this information you couldn't just go to the library and get, at least not most libraries, because there's no real major black publishing houses, except for the Journal of Negro Education, the Journal of Negro History and Journal of Negro Education, that they began to publish stuff. So it spread over a period of time, and it also took a while for it to begin to reach K-12 education. So you had more people like at the college level and post-high school type level, but then you had a low graduation rate from high school. So a lot of black people, they just simply weren't getting it. And so you had a population that was in essence out of touch with what really was happening. And a lot of people were led by propaganda or parts of cults or church groups or whatever. And there were some church groups who promoted black history and had black history programs. But the fact of the matter is that we look at what was happening, and we found ourselves in a situation where there was still a bottleneck in terms of between our scholars and the information and it getting out to the public. Okay. And so now we are in a situation where once school desegregation begins, and this is something I want to put a big emphasis on, the emphasis of school desegregation was placed on the integration of the school physically, the body of students. So you had, like, let's say you had an area and the population in the area, it was like 70% white and 30% black. So school desegregation focused on things like saying, okay, well, let's make sure that in our school, in our classroom, that we have 3 out of every 10 students, we should have 7 YT students and 3 black students. And we should have, this is integration. This is the way that they looked at it. And this is how they attempted to implement it. And of course, it didn't really work out that well. And what happened is, under this system, black children suffered, because very often as a black child, you go to a school and they, of course, in this transition, they eliminated most of the black teachers. So now you don't, in your whole career, you might have 1 black teacher out of 12 years of school. And because of the shortage of black teachers, and you began to look at this situation in terms of, so as a student, you go to school, you don't really have any black teachers. There's no one really telling you about black history or black culture. You're not getting any black education. And the information you are getting is distorted because most of the white teachers, they don't know anything about your history. They only know a distorted version of your history because of the culture that they grew up in, because of where they lived and the people that raised them in the communities that they grew up in. And so, of course, you had some conscientious YT teachers who diligently tried to learn so that they could be effective with black children. So they existed. We have to acknowledge them. But for the most part, there was an academic achievement gap that developed and widened. Why? Because black children were simply left out. They weren't really learning. Imagine you go to school your whole life and you might hear a little something about Martin Luther King. You might hear something about Harriet Tubman and Booker T. Washington and Frederick Douglass, but you don't know anything else about black history. You're not taught anything else about black history. So you don't really know any details about the civil rights movement. You don't really know any details about slavery and what happened during slavery. They don't tell you about the massacres that took place, the 100 or more massacres that took place after slavery. They don't tell you about the Red Summer of 1919 when about 36 cities where black communities were attacked by YT mobs all across the country. They don't tell you about these things. They don't tell you about the lynching. They don't tell you about the struggles in terms of for black progress. And they don't tell you even about black congressmen after the Civil War and black Reconstruction. Most of the information that they have is very superficial and limited, and they work to not, offend or say anything that will be offensive to the YT parents will have backlash over because their children were taught that. So what's happening is they're teaching Arnold Toynbee. They're teaching misinformation. So they're teaching from a perspective that black people did not make a creative contribution to any of the 21 human civilizations. That is what is established as the standard of knowledge. That is the baseline that they're operating from. They tell black children, well, the founding fathers, and they tell black children about the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and all men are created equal, and what lofty language this is, and what a wonderful thing it is, and what great people and patriots the founding fathers were. But they never stop and say, well, look, by the way, black people weren't included in this, and under the Dred Scott decision, the Dred Scott case said that, well, the founding fathers had no intention that black people would be citizens of the United States, and they didn't have any rights which YT people are bound to respect. They're not told that black people didn't become citizens of the United States until 1868. So black people didn't become citizens of the United States in 1776 when the Declaration of Independence was written. They didn't become citizens of the United States in 1787 when the United States Constitution was adopted. They became citizens in 1868 when the 14th Amendment was ratified. So is it fair to not tell black children this and make this distinction in the classroom? Is it something that they maybe should not just not know? They should stick their head in the sand and they don't need to understand the actual history. It's in essence lying to them. So they just simply lied to generations of black children. And so this is the system that was there, and then the issue became, of whether or not we should actually address the truth. Should we have a truthful and honest discussion? Should children be taught truthfully and honest, or should they be lied to and just given patriotic propaganda? And so when we began to take a look at this, it moves us to the modern situation that we're in, the modern debate that's going on now. And so it's important to be able to see this in the context, because at no time have we developed a comprehensive black history curriculum that has been deployed in the public school system. It's always been hit and miss. It's always been patchwork. It's always been taking a little piece of this and a little piece of that and putting it in there, and that's black history. There's never been any comprehensive addressing of critical issues. Like, for example, if you look at most modern curriculums across the United States, most states have what are called educational standards. And the state adopts a set of standards for each grade level. And in these standards, the standards actually set forth what a student should know and be able to do at each grade level. And they have standards for reading English language arts. They have standards for mathematics. They have standards for science. And they have standards for social studies. And then most states also, in addition, have standards that in some states will call it essential standards or secondary standards, or it's a separate set of standards that doesn't have as high a priority as the reading, math, and science. But these essential standards will include art and dance and music and various cultural type of things. It also may include other types of subjects like financial literacy and other things. So you've got all these different things that that are covered in these essential standards. But when you look at curriculum and how curriculum is deployed in the public education system, there's no solid and standard way to teach Black history, and it becomes a patchwork. And what happens is, if you are lucky enough to get a teacher that has some knowledge, then you might be blessed. But in reality, the vast majority of teachers aren't versed in it, and many don't want to have the controversy to bring this information into the classroom. And so you've had this movement in the United States to suppress Black history from the public education system. And there's always been this movement of what they call multicultural education movement, or teaching, or culturally responsive teaching movement. And that is looking at Black children, because you can look and see you have some extremely successful schools where Black children from poverty, Black children who traditionally do not succeed in the regular public education system, they are scoring in the 95th percentile. They are outperforming the most elite and prestigious YT schools. And how is this happening? And when you look at them, every single one of them has a robust Black history curriculum and program that they don't talk about openly, but what happens is they inspire Black children to learn. So they teach Black children details about Black history and let Black children discuss these details, and it stimulates them and turns them on to education. It stimulates their curiosity so that they want to read more and more. And so they develop the reading skills, they develop the math skills, they develop the science skills, they develop the skills associated with having their mind turned on to learning. And what's happening is that is what is happening in certain places across the country, but it's limited, and there's always an effort to suppress it. And as soon as they discover that it's fueled by Black history, they try to shut it down because they don't want it to exist. And so today you have, for example, this movement that has gone across the country where you've done the physical desegregation of people in schools. And of course, they've resisted it. And as a consequence, they said, okay, well, let's create charter schools. Let's do vouchers. Let's create new ways to segregate children in the school system. And they've done this. And this is something they've worked on, and have diligently worked to abandon the public school system. Now they're even trying to abandon the Department of Education. Why? Because they don't want integrated education. And particularly, they don't want Black history and Black knowledge in the public school system because of the impact that it has on the people in general. And so they promote this ideal that they don't want anything that's controversial. They don't want anything that makes YT people feel uncomfortable or feel guilty or feel they're responsible for what happened in history and all those kinds of things. And they've created this label, this narrative about critical race theory. And of course, most people that are knowledgeable and educated recognize that critical race theory was something developed by Professor Derek Bell. And of course, Professor Bell was a Harvard law professor, and he developed this theory about institutions in the United States. And basically, his position was that the way institutions in the United States developed, that there is vestiges of racism inherent in the institutions of the United States because of how they historically developed. And so he created a framework called critical race theory for analysis of the legal system and the legal structure. So he looked at the courts and how racism plays a role in disparities in sentences. Why is it that a black person and a white person who did the identical crime, have an almost identical background, they go to court, the judge gives the white guy probation, and he sends the black guy to jail for a long period of time? Why does that occur over and over and over and over again? And what he does is he created a framework to analyze why that is so, to look at why is it that there is a system of YT privilege where black people are not a part of that system, and YT people are the beneficiaries of the system, and it has a historical basis. It goes back in history. So what he does is he establishes a framework for this analysis, and it was called critical race theory. And then Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw comes along, and she expands this theory and looks at the same phenomena in education to talk about why is it that there is a 20 to 40 point academic achievement gap in reading, math, and science across the board for black children. In other words, like black children are like 20 to 40 points behind in reading, math, and science. Why? And she looks at the framework, a critical race theory, a framework of understanding the context of what is happening. And of course, a guy named Christopher Ruffo from the Manhattan Institute, a racist institution, a think tank. And what they did was they took this idea of critical race theory and they found a concept called critical theory that was part of the writings of Karl Marx. And they associated Derek Bell and Kimberly Crenshaw and critical race theory with Marxism and communism. And then they basically started a propaganda campaign and lied to the public about critical race theory and misrepresented what critical race theory is. And instead of the media scrutinizing it and saying, oh, wait a minute, you're lying, they went with it because it was a story that got them mileage, it got them viewers, and it inflamed YT people. And then all of a sudden you had YT people up in arms saying, well, look, we want certain books removed from the library. We don't want certain people, information. We don't want this stuff in our schools. So they're condemning critical race theory being taught in their schools, and critical race theory had nothing to do with teaching in schools. Absolutely nothing whatsoever. It was just a lie. It was a red herring. And they went for it. It's almost the same thing. I give you another example of this exact same phenomenon. It's like you had a bunch of YT people. They came out and they said, well, it's Obamacare. And everybody's like, oh, no, we don't want Obamacare. Obamacare we don't want it. It's garbage. We don't want it. It ain't good for us. It's Obamacare, and we don't want it. And then they came along and says, well, look here, what we're going to do is we're going to give you the Affordable Care Act. And, we're not dealing with Obamacare anymore. We're just going to give you the Affordable Care Act. And then we're like, okay, great. We got the Affordable Care Act. And, okay, they supported it. And that's how it got passed. When they were saying it was Obamacare, they were completely and totally against it. But when they started marketing it as Affordable Care Act, then it got passed. But they were too stupid to know that Obamacare was, in fact, the Affordable Care Act. That the Affordable Care Act was Obamacare. And they fought it ever since, until they've been able to recently try to destroy it. But the point of the matter is that is an example of inherent racism in the country, where you had people that because it's associated with a black man, Obama, they opposed it. They don't care what it was. They didn't care its value. They didn't care the benefit even to themselves. They just had such ingrained hatred for black people that Obama is a symbol of this black hatred that they hate. So they'll accept Obamacare, but they'll accept Affordable Care Act, but not Obamacare. Why? Because it's just raw, pure, unadulterated racism and ignorance. And that's where we're at. That's what exists in this country. And so I'll give you another example in terms of when you begin to, let's say, take a look at the fact that, you had this something called the Common Core State Standards. So what happened is President Obama, he organized a group of scholars. Now, these are scholars across multiple different disciplines. They're bipartisan. They are, it's a wide range of people involved. And they developed something called the Common Core State Standards. And what the Common Core State Standards did was it actually, like, for example, let's say if you went to school in Texas and then your family moved to North Carolina. Well, what you were taught, let's say you're in the third grade and you're in Texas, and now you move to North Carolina and you're in the fourth grade. And in North Carolina, you may learn in your fourth grade class what they learned in their third grade class. So you're going to repeat the year because there's no uniform system. And what was happening is military families who moved a lot all across the country, their children's education was just in chaos because there's no standardization as to curriculum. And so you had a lot of people, a lot of mobility of people that move every year. And what happened is there's no stability of curriculum. Not only that, there was no clear standards. Some states didn't have academic standards. Some states had very weak academic standards. But what Common Core did was establish a high academic standard for reading, English language arts, and math. And it focused on those two subjects to try to increase the quality of education. Why? Because the United States was falling behind in the international community in education. So what was happening is Chinese children from Singapore and Taiwan and, in other parts of the world were excelling way above children in America. So children in America were falling behind in education based on an international standard. And so the United States basically was being viewed, companies would look at it and say, well, wow, we'll move to China because they have more people educated there. We'll move to India because there's more people that are educated there. They can read, they can write, they can do the things we need to work. And but in America, not only are they not getting an education, but they're on drugs, they're on alcohol, they have all these other problems, they want so much time off of work, they want all these things, and have all these demands, and they're unproductive. They're going to produce inferior quality products for us. So that's what happened. Companies fled the United States. And people, they're blaming NAFTA, but who lobbied for those things? These companies that didn't want to deal with the American workforce. So they lobbied for changes in the law so that they could produce high quality products. And that's what happened because the American education system was falling down. But Obama came in with a program to restore it so that everyone could get a high quality education and to raise the academic standards. He came in with a number of programs to do that. And one of those was his organizing the Common Core State Standards. That was done by a bipartisan group of people, by a group of scholars and academics and people who were knowledgeable and experts in this field. And what happened is you had the racist elements, conservatives, use this and identify it with Obama as say this is the Obama curriculum. And that Obama wants to control the minds of your children. Obama wants this. And they use this to try to destroy the implementation of Common Core State Standards. And so this is another example of the operation of racism in America. And what happened is you began to look at this and understand what is happening here. You see that America was falling down. And so states started rejecting this, and the state legislatures opposed this because it was the Common Core State Standards, it was the Obama curriculum. And what happened is some of the state folk got together in different states, and what they do is they took it, they rearranged a couple of things slightly, changed the name of it, and came back and called it something else. And then the people were happy that they got this, that it was no longer the Obama curriculum. But it was still the exact same thing, just some slight rearrangements. But it was the marketing, the packaging. Because of the existence of racism, they didn't want it. And so that's, in terms of when we look at this happening right now. So today, about 20 states have passed laws to restrict the teaching of critical race theory. And so they've created such a controversy where, first of all, they don't have a real clear definition or understand what critical race theory actually is. So they don't want anything to be taught that indicates the existence of systematic racism, and they don't want what they call divisive racial concepts. So they don't want to talk about any of these things, and they've outlawed them in places like Florida and Texas and Tennessee and Oklahoma, in Alabama, in Arkansas, in Idaho, in Montana, in North Dakota, in South Carolina, in South Dakota, in Utah. So there's about 20 states that have adopted laws that ban critical race theory to some degree or another. And of course, most of these are not really clear on what's what. And what's happening is teachers now, they don't want to teach anything because of the controversy that comes out around it. Because if they try to teach anything about Black history, what happens is it offends some YT person because they don't think that they should learn about Black history. And so this is the world that we live in today. This is where we have come. And part of the reality of the situation, and I speak this from experience because I was involved in unitary status litigation in North Carolina in a federal court case, Everett versus Pitt County Schools. It was a case that went to the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals, and we had the National Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights, the UNC Center for Civil Rights, and the Decker Pro Bono Division, the Decker Law Firm. We had a world-class legal team. We fought this for like 10 years, and I like to think that we made a lot of progress. But one of the things that was very significant for me was the fact that the original situation in terms of unitary status was dealing with the issue. And unitary status means that the school system has done everything that they can do to the extent practicable, is the term used, to eliminate the vestiges of de jure racial segregation. That they've done everything to the extent practical to eliminate it. And so they then get declared unitary, and they're no longer subject to federal court order in terms of school desegregation orders. And that's how these school systems, many were under these orders for 20 or more years, some 30, 40 years. And so where they resisted the whole time, and then people got exhausted and didn't even try to enforce it. But the fact of the matter is that this unitary status never addressed the issue of curriculum. It never addressed the issue of what is being taught in school. And this is the new frontier. This is the critical frontier. And this is where the resistance is coming, because the regime of Donald Trump, what they want to do is they don't want to talk about Black history in the public education setting. And the question becomes, is it even fair to teach Black children that the founding fathers and the Declaration of Independence, and they were these wonderful people, and that in 1776, this Declaration of Independence said that, the that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that the United States Constitution was established, and this Constitution is such an important document in history, and establishes the foundation of our country. That all of these things, you teach black children this. You teach them to honor the founding fathers. You teach them to honor and respect all of this and see all these people as patriots and good people. But you don't tell them, by the way, black children, black people were not considered citizens of the United States when this was done. As a matter of fact, they didn't even consider black people as people. Black people were property. They were chattels at that time. And that's how they were viewed. In the United States Supreme Court says this. The United States Supreme Court documented this. The United States Supreme Court said that the founding fathers had not Ozie Hall's not saying that the founding fathers had no intention that black people would be citizens, or that black people had no rights which white people were bound to respect. Ozie Hall's not saying that. The United States Supreme Court said this in 1857. They said that the founding fathers had no intention that black people would be citizens of the United States. The United States Supreme Court said that black people had no rights which white people were bound to respect. And this is why you ultimately had a civil war. And then ultimately, black people had to investigate or had to take action in order to save the Union. And as a consequence, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed, and black people became citizens in 1868. Now, this is a very significant thing to learn, to understand. Black people became citizens of the United States in 1868. So if we want to teach, do we keep teaching black children that the founding fathers? Do we keep teaching black children about the lofty, work of creating the country without telling them, by the way, black people were excluded? And they weren't included to 1868. And these were the events that took place in order for them to get to the point where they could become citizens of the United States. So this is what the Trump administration wants. They want patriot education, but they don't want to teach the truth about what happened. They want and are promoting openly to teach lies, not only to black children, but to YT children too. Because if you don't tell them this truth of when black people became citizens and under what circumstance, you're lying to them as well. And so you become a liar to this generation of YT children. And what you do is you set up the future for failure. Why? Because you are still a racist. You're still reveling in racism. You're trying to hold on to a lie. And you ought to be condemned for it. The American people should condemn you for it and kick you out of the office. And everybody who's with you that supports you. And so that's the reality. And so in terms of looking at and really trying to understand where we are today, we are at a critical juncture in history where this is the next challenge. This is the debate that's on the table now. And this is the debate that has been set up. And it has not even begun to fully unfold. And that is to look at this actual history, because there are more and more people and sources and documentation of the facts and evidence of this history. Remember, Black history is at an infant stage in terms of its being brought into the public square, brought into the public circle. If we were to put all the information out there, it starts short-circuiting people's brain, because the world that they believe that they live in is not what they think it is, because if you look at the facts, if you look at the history and understand what happened, you'd have YT people supporting reparations for black people if they knew the actual truth, except for the ones who are racist, except for the ones who are bigots. Any reasonable person who looks at the facts and understands the facts can understand why it's important to heal the country. They would want to heal the country so that we can move forward as a nation. They would want to be able to say, hey, look, we acknowledge the fact that when the founding fathers did this, they didn't include black people. And we acknowledge the fact that black people didn't become citizens in the United States until 1868. We acknowledge that black people were exploited and robbed and looted and ripped off. And that's the real reason of why there's a massive wealth gap today. This is why the average YT family has between 13 and 17 times the accumulated wealth as the average black family. We acknowledge what happened. We understand what happened. If they had the facts and they were given this as part of their education. But what's happening now is YT people don't understand. They're being told, well, look, they're trying to take something away from you. They're trying to, take what you got. They're trying to, and then promoting these lies to black people. I mean, to YT people and to black people. So you got black people who they don't really know the history and truth. Some of them are going along with it. Why? Because they don't know any better because they haven't been taught the truth. And so this is why the truth is so powerful. This is why black history is so powerful today. Because it completely disarms all of this misinformation that they're using, this propaganda that they're using, that they're desperately trying to hold on to power by simply lying to stay in power. And they can't sustain like that because no lie can live forever. A lie cannot do it. A lie can't sustain it. The lie always is going to get exposed. And the more you lie, the more you got to try to cover up your lies, and you lie more and more and more, and eventually you're just a liar. And this is why even most scriptures will say that, that you're going to inherit the fire. It's like all liars. You're going into the lake of fire. And so in terms of this is what we have, we got a guy like Trump. He comes on TV every time he comes out. He lies every time. It's not a time that he doesn't have to have a lie, and whatever he says, it has to be a lie included in it somewhere, because he is a liar in nature. His nature is that of a liar. And so this is part of the reality. And then you got all these people trying to cover up his lies. So they're constantly trying to support and cover up and justify his lie because so that they can all stay in power. But how long can they sustain it? They can't sustain it very long. And they'll do some damage to the country before long. But you got to remember the Romanovs and what happened to the Romanovs, because that's history, and history has a tendency to repeat itself. And so, when you began to really take a look at and understand where we are now, this is history, the history of black history. It's important to understand the history of black history. It's important to understand how and why we celebrate Black History Month, and see that the Black History Month was sort of like a Trojan horse. It was a way to get into the middle of the society, to push our way in and say, hey, look, let's start examining these facts. Let's start looking at these facts. Let's start understanding what actually happened, and to talk about the history in such a way that that it can bring about change. You look today, and there are just so many things that are in the curriculums in the United States that are just simply based on a lie, based on misinformation. You can study world history, and they'll talk to you about Egypt, but they never tell you that the foundation of Egypt, the first to the 14th dynasty, it was indigenous black Africans. They don't tell you that. They make it, by the time you go through the curriculum, you think that, they were YT people or Middle Easterners, but they weren't black people. And that's not true. You can go through systematically and see that racism is built into the system. So they're still teaching white supremacy in the public education system. And this is the standard that they want. They want to maintain a standard of teaching white supremacy because they don't want the truth to come out. In reality, the truth would strengthen America because what it would do, it would bring about a harmony because the current generations didn't do this stuff. The current generations could look at this and say, well, wow, we repent for the past generations. We repent for what they did. Let's harmonize and let's move forward together. Let's work in harmony with each other. Let's build and strengthen our nation together. But instead of doing that, what Trump is trying to do is beat down portions of the population and subjugate them and continue to perpetuate white supremacy in lies and misinformation. And that just simply cannot work. And it won't work. And it will destroy the entire country that people have worked and struggled to build over years. People have submitted themselves to all kinds of things in order to make this country work, to sacrifice to make this country succeed. And it's made progress step by step. Its barriers have been knocked down, doors have been opened, civil rights legislation and voting rights legislation and fair housing legislation and all kinds of programs and things have been implemented to keep moving us forward. And we've been moving forward, and then you get a Donald Trump to come along to set us backwards, to take us backwards, to become divisive, to try to divide the whole nation and put Democrat against Republican and get people fighting against each other. And then this is the reality of the circumstances that we're dealing with. And so in terms of looking at it and understanding where we are and recognizing where we are in time and space, it's critical for us to continue to study Black history and to learn the truth and understand where we are in time and space. And for me, Black history is sacred. And I say sacred Black history because it is just as sacred as the scriptures of the Bible. It's just as sacred as the scriptures of the Quran or the Bhagavad Gita or any of the ancient sacred writings, because Black history has come to us in the same fashion. People struggled. They wrote this down because they were inspired. They collected this information. They hid it and secured it and did things to preserve it, to pass it down to the next generation. And we have it today by divine providence. We have it today because it has been delivered to us by the hand of God Almighty, because otherwise we wouldn't have it. If you look at the struggles that have been gone through in order for us to get it, if you look at the sacrifices that have been made for us to get this information. And so it's something that we have to work to preserve, that we need to understand. So with that, thank you for taking the time to listen. And I pray that this has blessed someone and that we all continue to study together. Be blessed and have a wonderful day. Thank you for taking the time to listen.